Hello everyone, welcome to week 4. This week's lecture we're going to be looking at gender, sexuality and power. We're going to concentrate predominantly on women and social work within this lecture. So your readings for this week are the textbook, both chapters 7 and 8. It was pointed out on the forum that I had in the learning module for week 3 right at the end that you needed to read these for the week coming ahead, and sometimes I'll do that, and please don't feel pressured to read it the week before, but just letting you know, I guess, what's coming up in the coming weeks. There are also additional readings and some podcasts within your learning modules for this topic. So firstly, some key considerations when we're looking at this topic. I think firstly, we need to acknowledge that social work really is a profession dominated by women, both as clients and as workers. Gender and sexuality influence how people experience social issues as well. This is just another link to the YouTube from your modules, which is Jackson Katz presenting a TED talk on violence against women. It's 19 minutes, so it's a little bit lengthy, but well worth a watch when you get a chance. So you can either click on it from this lecture or PowerPoint, or you can access it from your modules. So the UN said in 2006 that violence against women and girls is one of the most pervasive and systemic human rights violations within the world. Up to 7 in 10 women in the world report having experienced physical and/or sexual violence at some point throughout their lifetime, and up to 50% of sexual assaults are committed against girls under 16. So, some indicators of ongoing significant inequality and disadvantage for women. Women in Australia earn 18.8% less than men, and the gender gap has actually widened in the last few years, the gender pay gap, sorry. So women chair 2% of Australian stock exchange companies and hold 8.3% of board directorships. Really small numbers there for women in those higher end roles. Superannuation payouts for women average $63,000 and for men $136,000, and this figure isn't just related to the fact that women are earning a lot less, but it's also related to the fact that women quite often throughout their lifetimes may be out of paid employment for reproductive reasons, caregiving reasons, lots of different reasons. So there's a multitude of things that lead to women having significantly less super than men, and I'm sure that there's lots you could think of yourself as well. 73% of single-age pension recipients are women, and Australia has made great strides towards achieving equality between men and women. However, systematic barriers still remain. So a little bit about women's predominance as clients in social work. We work with women in a lot of different contexts. We work with single parents. We work with women as victims of violence. We work, there's a feminisation of poverty too, which I'll talk a little bit about later on in the lecture. Also, women are carers, paid and unpaid, and 70% of caretaking is undertaken by women, and lots of other ways in which women make up a significant client base in our work. Women's predominance as social workers. So for all the fellas in this class, it's not all bad news, but you are in a profession that's fairly dominantly female. 75% of social workers in Australia are women. 89% of new graduates are women. So really just think about the personal, the political and the professional implications of gender. Not too much on the history. I mean, you can read through the slides here yourself, but as we spoke about in week 1, the welfare field has this post-colonial tradition of really women-centred services, and we saw women such as Elizabeth Fry and Caroline Chisholm really leading these movements and really beginning the thinking around welfare and what it looks like. And of course at this stage they were tailored towards women. Second wave feminism through the 60s and 70s saw a criticising of existing mainstream services for reproducing social inequality and by espousing traditional roles for women and limiting choice and self-determination. In the 1970s, there was a major reform agenda implemented through the Whitlam government. The first women's advisor was appointed, who was Elizabeth Reed. We saw a women's affairs section of Department of PM and Cabinet established, which was later to become known as the Office for Status of Women. Activism, there was a women's electoral lobby quite strongly advocating for women's electoral rights at this stage, and links between lobbyists, community agencies and bureaucracies were beginning to really cement and become a lot stronger. Violence against women was increasingly recognised during this era. Women's refuges were opened and often staffed by volunteers. And in 1975, we saw the International Year of Women, and this really worked to increase public awareness around women's issues and, in some instances, increase funding for women's services as well. So, social movements for sexual equality. The women's movement happened in three main waves. So your first wave really focusing on citizenship rights and the right to vote. Second wave throughout the 60s to about the mid-80s expanded that agenda quite considerably. And your third wave, which we are in really at the moment from the 1980s to the present, focuses on more complex, subtle and probably systemic issues for women. A little bit on social movements for sexual equality. So your LGBTIQ movements really reject heterosexuality as a cultural norm and challenge that assumption as well in a lot of ways. Undermines the simplistic division between female and male, straight and gay, and that it's more fluid than that, and there's a lot more to it than that. We've seen struggles for respect, acceptance and full citizenship rights, which were ongoing for those who are members of the LGBTQI, I've got it mixed up on my slide, community. And most prominently we see those discussions and those fights and struggles happening within the political arena as well. Stumbling over my words today, sorry. Your pro-feminist men's movement as well has also been quite influential. Have a little read on the slide about that. I'm interested in not sort of reading directly from the slides. I know it can be really useful to read the information and absorb it yourself as well. Some key legislation in Australia. So luckily not too much to get your head around here. I've just highlighted two key legislation that's really good to have a bit of an idea about what they look like and what they do in terms of this topic. So you've got the Human Rights Commission Act of 1986. So previously, and I mean this is a name that people commonly still use, which is the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Act of 1986. So it obviously created the commission at that stage, and the Human Rights Commission has statutory responsibilities under a number of laws to investigate and to support and to advocate. So one of those laws being the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984. This act promotes equality between men and women. It aims to eliminate discrimination on the basis of sex, marital status, or pregnancy, and with respect to dismissals and family responsibilities as well, and eliminate sexual harassment in the workplace, in educational institutions, in the provision of goods and services, and in the provision of accommodation and delivery of Commonwealth programs. So as a part of this act, we also have in Australia a Federal Sex Discrimination Commissioner. So Kate Jenkins became Federal Sex Discrimination's the mouthful commissioner in 2016. There's some really helpful information about Kate online if you wanted to chase that up. In the YouTube clip down below, when you click on it, Kate shares some information about a report that she wrote quite recently. She was sort of started in the position in 2016, and then this report was published a few short months later, about 6 months I think, and the report's entitled A Conversation in Gender Equality. And what the report aimed to do is to find out what the prominent issues were for women in Australia, and in doing so Kate consulted with communities and consulted with women all over Australia to get these ideas. So There's the full report is, if you follow this link here, if you click on the little TV here, there's a really snappy little, obviously created by marketing YouTube about the findings in this report, and it can sometimes be easier to digest information through watching these sort of things. So if you're not interested in reading the whole report, which is also quite beautifully presented and really nice and visual and that sort of thing, there's also the YouTube. But in addition to that, I've popped some information on the next slide. So what were the findings of this report? Underneath my face there, you've got the cover of the report. So the first priority that was identified within this report was in terms of violence against women. Priority 2 was women's economic safety, and priority 3 was having a women's voice and diversity in decision making. As you can see, some of these things are we've already touched on at the start of the lecture, and they've been issues that have been fought for through the feminist movement and through advocacy in terms of women's rights over the years. And I guess it's not surprising that it was found within conversations around the country that these were prominent issues. What I did find interesting were some of the emerging themes from these conversations, and I've detailed these below. Within the report, Kate actually outlines what all these themes are about. So if something strikes your interest, just jump into the report and have a read about that area. For example, the first one is living in rural and regional and remote communities. And what this theme relates to is that it was often found in these conversations Kate had with women that within these rural, regional and remote communities, feelings and ideas around gender were, I've forgotten the beautiful wording she used, but they were quite discriminatory. And there was still a feeling in a lot of these communities that women were seen as in an inferior and non-equal position within society. So some interesting reading there as well. And I mean, interesting to think about and reflect on. Is it something that's prominent throughout the country, or is it a rural, regional and remote issue particularly? Not very surprising in terms of the fact that women are experiencing violence within the home. Online, I didn't find very surprising, but also it was found a recurrent theme was that women are experiencing violence within the workplace and in public spaces also. Quite concerning. I mean, when we look at that, when we look at home, work, public space and online, where are women not experiencing violence? It sort of encapsulates all areas in which women permeate society. So quite concerning, I guess. The third theme was negative attitudes and everyday sexism. The fourth theme, gender equality in all employment, so that there were sectors that there really wasn't equal representation of women in those areas, which is of no surprise, and we'll talk a little bit about that at the end of the presentation too. Women's economic security, as we touched on before, obviously your wage gap, there's super issues, lots of different things. And I mean, that's interrelated with your violence and that sort of thing as well. So, I mean, that's a whole other discussion there. But please jump onto the forums, as I urge every week, if you have any further questions or clarification on these issues. Women at work was another theme. Women's voice was another theme that came through these conversations. Women's needs and women's services, which I'll talk a bit about as well as community engagement in solutions. So as we've identified throughout the subject so far, it's not very useful having government making decisions for a minority. It's just not. And when we look at the figures later on in this presentation, we get a bit more of an idea of why another reason why it might not be appropriate as well. So women's services, some key features down the left-hand side here, as well as some examples of what women's services might be or what they might look like. Are there some in your communities that you're aware of? Is there not? I know that out here, I'm in Western New South Wales, we don't really have a lot of women's specific services. Most of our services are open to all genders, and there isn't really a lot of those women specific, but please correct me if you're in a Western community and there are some that you're aware of. Gender and sex, what's the difference? For any of you who have been very on top of your study and have read Hughes' 2013 chapter within your textbook, what does Hughes say about sex, gender binaries, intersex, transsex, identity and orientation? What are the ideas within that? I think for some of us these are new terms. For some of us we're quite familiar with what all of these terms mean. So getting your head around them at this point in your studies of social work is really important as well. So just some more questions for reflection from the Hughes chapter. And I know we've got the forum discussion around this, but just having a think about these questions as you're developing your own identity as a professional. Do these things that you are comfortable with and aware of in terms wise in your personal life, is it something that you work with in your professional life, or is it something that you're just not really aware of? So have a think about some of these reflective questions. I'm very aware that I'm talking fairly fast today, so sorry for that. This next YouTube that I've popped up is a really short one, a 4-minute video, and it's entitled "It Only Takes a Girl." I would urge you to watch this at your leisure. Quite a thought-provoking and really moving piece. So again, just to watch it, double click there. Gender. So I found this handy little pic that I thought really tied in well with our topic of gender and gender assumptions, I guess. So gender inherently influences social policy. It often supports women's position as secondary, assumptions about caring work, and also the invisibility of unpaid work as well. The welfare state developed actually as a system of government support using social security and taxation systems which were based on 3 main assumptions: that women were responsible for that caring work and unpaid work in the home, and that men were in paid employment, and that the state supports women when no male was able to do so. And for any of you who know a little bit about your history in Australia, you'll be familiar with the Harvester Judgment of 1907. So this was a judgment within the courts that said that your basic wage for a man needs to be enough to support himself, his wife, and 3 children. So that's how the sort of benchmark of minimum basic living wage was established at that time. And this was only challenged in 1958, where the challenge came in, well, yes, of course, women are getting paid less because men are getting paid at this level that's supposed to be supporting everybody, and wages are still not equal, as we well know. A little bit on power here, and I referred to this earlier. So what is power? And I really wanted to draw attention to this, and I had to go and grab sort of the contemporary statistics here, and actually when I looked at it from last year, I forgot, my stats were last, I think, collected in 2015, but when I recently checked it a few days ago, there's actually far less women in the House of Reps now. So of 150 members, only 43 of those are women, which makes up almost 30%, but not quite. The Senate's looking a bit better with 43 men and 31 women. So, I mean, this correlates back with what I was speaking about earlier in the presentation about those who have the power to make decisions that affect people's lives, and how appropriate it is to have 71% representation of someone making a decision on things that affect affect women, or policy that directly affects women. So just, yeah, I mean, something to think about. So a little bit on gender and power and ideology and power as well. So gender and power. So we really see within society a privileging of the male worldview and downplays women's invisibility. So social work sometimes and social welfare is referred to housekeeping. It's often devalued and invisible. I know that out of all of the professions, I think welfare and social workers are some of the hardest working professionals out there, yet some of the lowest paid also. So we can see where that devaluing of the work comes into play as well, and lots of different things to think about there as well. And also we need to think about, in terms of power, social work as social control. Power and power of social work is something that sits really uncomfortably with a lot of students. But we do need to remember, I mean, the past of social work and how much power still social workers and welfare workers hold. No matter what role you're in, you could be in the most empowering role ever, but by its very nature of being an educated professional who's in employment, I mean, there's power inherently there. So in terms of ideology and power, ideology filters through which social world is interpreted. So ideology around that women are supposed to be at home in a private space, whereas men are legitimate public space inhabitants, and caring portrayed as a gendered identity. So I have referred to this concept throughout the lecture of ideology. And I know that as social workers and welfare workers, and probably personally in our personal lives, we like to think that we don't hold some of these ideologies, and that we're quite balanced in our views. And I think it takes a lot of self-reflection, and these stereotypes and these ideologies are really quite on a really pervasive level within society, and they're difficult to escape. I guess a key example is that my children I've tried to bring up in the same way. I don't treat my girls different to what I treat my boy, and I've always got a wider range of toys and books and things for them to play with that aren't gender specific. However, I find my toddler daughter really gravitating towards dolls and caring for them. Not that my son doesn't, but he would prefer probably to get a truck or to do some construction with blocks more so than my small daughter. And I know this isn't the case for all situations, but I'm not sure. And they both attend a family daycare centre, and I don't know whether those gendered ideologies are something that they're getting from there, or if it's something inherent. And I think it's just worth some reflection. And I think as much as we like to think that these ideas aren't pervasive for all of us, we do need to constantly reflect and think about these things. So, some issues for social work are recognising inequality for our clients and for the profession as a female-dominated and undervalued profession. We need to work for social justice, for empowerment and for social change. I guess they're key values of social work itself, but I think they're also really important when we're talking about gender and power issues. So moving forward, this is a very comprehensive slide. Instead of sort of having a really long-winded lecture, I've popped it all on this one little slide. But have a read through that. But they're just some ideas about moving forward and what we need to be doing and what we need to be thinking about. And finally, just some references there as well. So thank you for listening today to my ramblings again. But please, again, hop on the forum. There's some really great conversations happening on the forum, and let's share our views and our ideas. And I mean, I think the beauty of discussion is in difference. So please jump on there and have a really lively discussion. Thank you.